Hello, everyone, and welcome to the monthly Bangkok RELO webinar. My name is Heather Van Fleet, and we are coming live to you from Bangkok as this webinar series is supported by the U.S. Embassy and AUA Language Center. This evening, I will be hosting the webinar and making sure everything runs smoothly. I am happy to welcome Kelley Calvert from Chiang Mai as our webinar presenter this month. Kelley is currently serving as an English language specialist with the U.S. Department of State. She works closely with AUA Language Center and the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok to enhance language instruction in Thailand. Today, Kelley will be sharing some interesting techniques for using board games in your classroom. The webinar will be about an hour long with time for questions at the end. If you have a question, please put it in the chat box and it will be addressed during the Q&A part of the webinar. That's it for me. Kelley, please take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Heather, for that wonderful introduction. Today, I will be talking about using board games in the classroom. I really appreciate everyone who has taken time out of their busy Thursday afternoon to be here and learn some techniques that they can bring into their classroom. That being said, our outline for today's presentation. First, I want to talk a little bit about why we use games. So why should we use games to begin with in the classroom? I'll give a brief overview and introduction to the Activate games. For those of you who don't know, Activate is a set of games available on the American English website, which I will go over. We'll look at some example game boards and talk about how we might use them in class. We'll talk about making our own games, and that will be the bulk of the presentation today. We will talk about some classroom management tips. And finally, at the end of the webinar, as Heather kindly pointed out, I'll take some questions. So if you have questions during the webinar itself, if you could please just put those in the chat box, and then we'll address them at the end of the presentation. That would be great. Thank you. So I wanted to start today with a little bit of a poll. Heather, would you pull up the poll for us?
There you are.
Okay, so the questions are, question number 1, do you enjoy having fun? Question number 2, do you think your students like having fun? The third question, do you think your students will enjoy learning English more if they're having fun? And the last question, do you think that students can learn and have fun? It'll take a few minutes so that you can vote.
We've got a few participants who have voted, just about half of the attendees.
Okay. Maybe wait one more minute here to see what others think. Okay, so as I expected, I think that most of us enjoy having fun. The last question of do we think students can learn and have fun perhaps is a little more divided. I just wanted to share some of my thoughts on that idea. So I think that students learn best when they are having fun and when they are engaged. And I think many of us who have experienced language learning can also attest to that. Yeah, so when we talk about theory and the effective filter hypothesis by Stephen Krashen, one of the things that he points out is that students often experience a blockage in their language learning when they feel anxious or worried or bored. So I think the more that we can help students relax, the more we can help them learn better. So some of the benefits of using board games in class, including the Activate games, are of course that it allows them to practice the language. It's also a way for them to develop their social skills. So learning language in and of itself is of course social. And it also keeps the brain active. When we have a teacher in front of us in the classroom, it's very easy to zone out. But if you're engaged in a game, you have to stay active. You have to keep participating. Some other benefits, of course, games allow us to move towards a learner-centered classroom. When we talk about a classroom being learner-centered, essentially what that means is moving away from a teacher fronted classroom and focusing more on the learners themselves. And I think games also allow us to have a low stress classroom. So playing games is low stakes. You're not worried about how well you're performing. Rather, you're playing the games and having a good time. So, and using board games, they're great for developing and reinforcing concepts. So anything that you're talking about in your lessons, you can help students reinforce those ideas with board games. They're a welcome diversion to our regular activities in the classroom. So whether you do it once a week or once a month, board games can be quite fun for your students. They're also a great way to break the ice. So at the beginning of class or the beginning of a term, board games can really serve the purpose of breaking the ice. And last but not least, board games allow us to practice our communication skills. But most importantly, board games are fun. So when we think about our use of board games, not to get too carried away into the intellectual side of things, but remembering that board games are a fun way to encourage interaction in the classroom. So if you don't mind, I'm just curious, how many of you have used board games in class? Could you raise your hand? You should see a sign at the bottom of your screen or at the top of your screen to raise hand. Okay. Heather, can you see how many people have raised their hand?
Yep, sorry, not right now, not yet.
Okay.
Oh, yes, sorry, yes. If you look at the participants, you can see that there are.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So 4 of you say that you have used your board games. Great. And what about the Activate games? How many of you have actually used Activate in your classroom? Could you raise your hand, please? Okay, great. So approximately half of the attendees also have used Activate in class. Perfect. So I'll talk a little bit more about Activate for those of you who are not familiar with it. Activate, again, is sponsored by the US Department of State. And these games are all available, open source, completely free on the American English website. So you can download these materials for free. There's also teaching tips that can help you with the Activate games. The website is americanenglish.state.gov /resources/Activate board games. So you'll find on this website the Activate games, but you'll also find so many other resources. It's well worth your time to visit the website and browse because there's some great resources there. So let's talk a little bit about the board games themselves. Right away, the notice when I look at the games is that they're brightly colored. They're very engaging for learners. You can go to your local copy shop and print these in color, and your students will be drawn into them simply by their nice design, I think. There are 11 Activate games, and they are What Do I Know About, Which One is Different and Why, What You Might Find, Name 3, Would You Rather and Why, Name Your Favorites, and the ones that I'll talk a little bit more about today are Have You Ever and When, What Someone Does, Which One Would the World Be Better Without and Why, Use a Word, and About Me. So Have You Ever, Oh When, this game is a great icebreaker because it allows students to get to know each other a little bit better and it gets them talking. It allows them to find common experiences, and a lot of them are kind of fun questions that I find that students laugh at these quite a bit. In terms of the grammar, obviously this is a language focus on the present perfect tense, asking questions, have you ever done this? Have you ever done that? So students get to practice asking questions in the present perfect and then answering those questions in the present perfect. But it's also a chance for them to notice the past participles, both regular and irregular. So you can see, have you ever played a piano? That's a regular past participle versus have you ever seen a ghost? You have the irregular participle. So it gives them a chance to actually notice those verbs. Another grammar board game is What Someone Does. What Someone Does focuses on prepositions and sentence formation with those prepositions. But it's also vocabulary building. So if you land on what someone does in a kitchen, for example, you have to have the vocabulary to describe objects in a kitchen. So along with the grammar practice, it is also vocabulary. Another game that practices grammar is Which One Would the World Be Better Without? The language focus here is the conditional tense with would and if, and using because to give reasons. So for example, which one would the world be better without? TV, mosquitoes, or divorce? Personally, I think the world would be better without mosquitoes because mosquitoes cause disease. In that instance, I'm practicing the conditional tense and also giving a reason for it. And then we also have board games that are vocabulary practice. So this one is called Use a Word. And the focus here again is building vocabulary and increasing fluency with a variety of words. So one thing that you'll notice though, these words are not thematic. They're not based on one given theme. They seem a little bit random. So you do get to increase your fluency with a variety of words, but it might not specifically focus on what you're covering in your lessons. So one of the things that I'd like to point out today is that all of these games are adaptable to your classroom. So for example, the Use a Word board game could be adapted for a variety of vocabulary lessons, whether you're talking about sports or classroom objects or animals or foods. You could create your own game board, which we'll talk more about and where you can find templates for those game boards. You can also adapt the game for different levels. On the American English website, it also talks about different ways to adapt these games. If we look at About Me, this is a game that I've used on the first day of class because it allows students to get to know one another better with sentence starters like, I think English class is, one animal I would like to be is. But you might notice that the language necessary for this game is a little bit too advanced for your beginners. So if you wanted to create an adaptation of About Me for beginners, you might create a game that uses just the verbs I am or I have. So I have one brother, or I am 3 meters tall. I don't think so, but we'll say that. Or I am a teacher, right? So just using the have verb and to be verb. So before we move on, I had another question for you all. This is another poll, if Heather could pull it up. The question is, which do you think is more important, accuracy or fluency?
Okay, the poll is up and people have started voting. Some people had some issues with the last poll, so if you are having any problems, please let us know in the chat box. We'll give it some time. Almost 75% of people have voted. It looks like the majority, about 60%, are at equally important, and 30% at fluency, and 40% at accuracy.
Okay, great. So I have a few thoughts on this. When we look at fluency versus accuracy and which one is more important, Accuracy, of course, is the correctness of the language that is being used, whereas fluency is being able to get your message across without too many pauses or hesitations. Fluency usually comes before accuracy, and it's important to keep in mind that accuracy or full accuracy may not ever occur. So I've worked with some very, very, very advanced non-native English speakers, and still they would be so hard on themselves about accuracy because, with things like articles and prepositions, complete accuracy may not ever be acquired. And that's okay, because in my opinion, I think fluency is much more important because it enables communication. And what other reason are we learning a language other than communicating? So one of the things I love about games is that it's encouraging fluency over accuracy. So students are having fun and they actually feel like they can speak without that, inner critic hanging over their shoulder and yelling at them all the time. With that said, I would add that teachers are, without doubt, the best game creators. And the reason for that is that we as teachers, we know what content we're covering in our classes. We know what grammar points we're covering in our classes. We know our students. We know what they need. So based on that, we can create games that are directly relevant to our students. So once again, if you go to the American English website, you can download the board game templates, and there's several available for free. You can watch a teaching video that will also help you with that. Just out of curiosity, can I see a show of hands of how many of you have made your own video game?
So again, that's just selecting the hand at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand to see if you have ever made your own board game.
Okay, I see one hand.
Yep.
Anybody else? Okay. So one teacher has raised their hand to creating their own board game. And I hope that after this session, many more of you will be able to raise your hands. Because again, games can be very helpful and they can be very targeted to your own classroom. You might have some questions when you start creating your games. So some things to consider is what type of language will the students use? So think about what grammar point you're trying to teach them, and what exactly you'll put inside the game squares. And perhaps most importantly, how can you make your own game personal and relevant to the students? So I'm going to show you a lot of different examples, and I think by the end, you'll start to have a better realization of how you might be able to create your own games. I know it can seem intimidating if you've never done it before, but it's actually quite simple once you get the hang of it. So after this webinar, you will receive links to all of the game boards I'm about to show you. You'll also get a recording and the slides from today. So don't worry about trying to remember everything. You will get a follow-up email. So the board games I'm going to show you now are related to speaking, pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, and culture. So you'll see a couple of examples of each type, starting with speaking games. So in this speaking game, all I've done here is put some statements, and the students would roll the dice, and then whichever number they receive, they move their game piece forward, and then they have to agree or disagree. So if I got a 1 and I moved 1 space, I would land on books are better than movies. And I would say, I agree that books are better than movies because books encourage our imagination. Okay, and then we would continue the game. So this is a speaking practice about expressing opinions. You could also design a game like this one, seeking advice. So you would work with a partner, roll your die, and if you landed on number 60, for example, I got fired from my job, I would read out loud, and then my partner would have to give me advice, probably using modal verbs if we wanted to get into some grammar content. So I got fired from my job. Heather, what should I do?
I don't know.
What must I do? I must look for another job, right? You should look for another job. Okay.
You should ask a friend who has some ideas.
Yeah, hopefully your partner will have some good advice for you. Like, I'm feeling lonely. What should you do? You should get off the internet and go socialize.
You should call a friend.
There you go. Call a friend. So another game, which I learned from Heather tonight, is actually a common board game in the US. I had never played it, but this is Guess Who. So this is a game that encourages students to learn how to describe people. So again, working in pairs, you would select a character, and then your partner has to ask questions, yes or no questions, until they can guess who you have chosen. So Heather, have you chosen a character?
Yes, I have.
Okay, is it a boy or is it a girl?
A boy.
Does he have a beard?
No, he doesn't.
Does he have short or long hair?
He has short hair.
Does he have any facial hair?
No.
Does he have
No
a big,
eyebrows.
does he have a big nose? Does he have a big nose?
Yes, he has a big nose.
Does he have big ears?
I think his ears are similar to everyone else's, so they look a little big.
Okay, so is your character Joe?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So again, this is just a great way for students to practice their descriptions and how to describe people. This is an example board game from Indonesia called What Would You Say If? And this game board was developed to practice ordering food in a restaurant. So what would you say if the waiter asks, what can I do for you? Or what would you say if you want dessert? So this is a great way to practice a specific communicative context, ordering food in a restaurant. There are also ways to integrate pronunciation practice into board games. So this is one I developed for a common pronunciation error that I've noticed with Thai speakers of English, and that is the ch versus sh sound. So in this game, the students would roll the die, and then when they land on a word pair, they have to say the words and then use them in a sentence. So for example, ship and chip. Sailors live on a ship, and I like to eat fish and chips. That's a tongue twister there. This is a good way to make your students dislike you greatly, games like this one. You can also do pronunciation practice with nouns and verbs. So these are all words that change meaning depending on if it's a noun or a verb. So for example, conflict versus conflict. So you could have your students play this game once where they say the word as a noun and then use it in a sentence. And then they play it again and say the word as a verb and use it in a sentence. So there was a conflict in the Middle East and their stories conflict. So this would be a way for students to practice pronunciation practice speaking. You can also do kind of a similar game. Talking about games could not possibly be complete without talking about bingo. This is more of a listening activity. So in this game, the teacher has to read the word out loud. And usually I read them out loud twice. And then the students have to decide if it's a noun or a verb. And the first student to get a bingo wins. So again, you would say conflict, and students would have to put their chip on the word in the top left corner. I use the website myfreebingocards.com, and on that website, when you create the word list like this, it also generates 20 random bingo cards where the words are in all different orders. So that way you have a true bingo game happening in your class. You can also, of course, use board games for grammar. This is an example game in passive voice. So students again would roll the die, and then when they land on a sentence, for example, if they land on the first box, it says they built this bridge in 1602. That is an active voice, and their job is to change that into passive voice. So this bridge was built in 1602. So this would be a great activity, a great game, if you were teaching passive voice. This is another example of a grammar activity. And in this one, it's there, and there. And students have to choose the correct form of the word to go into the blank. If you wanted, you could even have the students write the word in the blank, and you could check their answers for them. Another use of board games is teaching about culture. So last week, maybe the week before, time all blends together, I had a movie screening of a holiday movie at the American Corner in Chiang Mai. And just to kind of prep the students, we played a Christmas speaking game about Santa Claus and all things holiday related. And it was fun. I think it gave them a lot of cultural background to the movie that they were about to see, things that they might not understand without the board game. And of course, you can do this for any holiday. For example, Halloween would be another game board that you could use. So once again, just as a reminder, we've talked about speaking games, pronunciation games, grammar games, vocabulary games, and culture games. And after the webinar, you will receive links to all of these awesome game boards, so don't worry. At this point, I'm going to transition a little bit into some classroom management tips of things that you might want to do in your classroom if you decide to use board games. So the first tip is, of course, always remember that your students are going to be in groups. That seems obvious and self-evident, but it does require some preparation. So thinking to yourself, how many students do I have? Do your math. Even though we're English teachers, sometimes we have to do math. So if you have 50 students and you're doing, let's say, the Guess Who game, if you're going to have them work in pairs, you would need 25 groups, which means you would need 25 game boards. For a game like About Me, you might have 4 or 5 students in a group because you want to encourage more people to participate and more conversation. So in that case, you might need only 10 to 12 game boards for that class. So you have to prepare and think about how many game boards you're going to need. And related to that, you also have to think about materials. But I want to emphasize that you don't need a lot of materials. So that's where the do-it-yourself comes in, DIY. If you don't have dice, for example, it's not a problem. There's a lot of alternatives to dice. For example, you can just put slips of paper in a little bag, with each slip of paper having a number 1 through 6. You can also go to the American English website. Again, Activate. They do have a dice template there, so you can just cut it out and glue it. I've used it. It works perfectly fine. Some other creative solutions, you can use a pencil and write the numbers 1 through 4 on each side of the pencil and roll the pencil. You can shake a bean in an egg carton. You can even use playing cards, ace to number 6. The same holds true with your game pieces. You can use anything for game pieces. You can use buttons, coins, paper clips, shells, bottle caps, anything. Tip number 3, you should have some kind of system for rotating materials, particularly if you're playing more than one game. So for example, you might have 4 different stations set up, and you have to think about how you want your students to rotate. So clockwise, counterclockwise. Students can pass the game board after a certain period of time, whether that be 5 or 10 or 15 minutes. And it's up to you if you use a timer. One thing that I found useful with the games, if you're starting a class and students tend to run late, which never happens in Thailand, I know. But if your students tend to run late, you can have games at the beginning where, it's not a high stakes thing. And so you have, 10 or 15 minutes where it's them playing games and enjoying themselves, warming up. Tip number 4, you have to think in terms of your group stations. So whenever I've used games in class, I tend to arrive early to my classroom to push the desks together and create the stations. You can always ask your students for help with that. I think they generally enjoy being of assistance. And then I would also recommend using the games to informally assess your students. I think this is particularly effective when you're doing pronunciation, for example. So you can walk around your classroom with a checklist to kind of take some notes while they're playing games. You can write down frequently occurring errors, things that you notice with pronunciation. For example, using the ch, example, if you notice that your students are having trouble distinguishing between chip and ship, then that might be something that you would have them practice more together as a class. So it's a great way to kind of get some data and some information about their speaking skills. And the last tip I wanted to give today is getting students involved. So I talked a lot about creating your own games, but another fun way to use games is to actually have your students design them. So a way that you can do that is first have your class create a list of the current game board titles from Activate. So if you've used Activate in class, you can use those as kind of ideas for your class to brainstorm. So then, based upon those games, you ask students to brainstorm new topics, whether it be within vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, culture, or speaking, and have them base their ideas off of the examples. Then you put the students in groups and give them a chance to design their own games. So they need to choose a title and a subject matter for their games, and then they brainstorm the game content for the squares. Once they've had time to prepare and they've brainstormed their ideas, then you pass out the markers, the pens, and the blank game boards, and let students create their own. You should remind students to include 2 or 3 go back or skip a turn squares. And then last, you have your students exchange their games with other groups and play. So that goes back to that rotation station, after they play a game for 10 minutes, they switch and they switch again. And then you have a whole library, a whole collection of games that you can use for review at any time. So if you liked what you saw today about the Activate games, I did want to point out that in addition to these 11 ready-to-use board games, there are several other resources. There's the Picture This card. These are 24 picture cards that can be used for 14 games. And the Guess What cards, there's 24 of them with a topic and 6 related words. They can be used for 8 different games. And then we have the word bricks. Those are 140 word bricks. And that's a collection of nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, all of which can be used in 10 different games. And these are described in the Activate book, available on the American English website. So I hope you have enjoyed our webinar this evening. Our next one will be on Thursday, January 24th, 2018. To find out the topic of that website, please follow on Facebook, RELO Bangkok and the AUA Language Center, and you will see updates there. So I hope to hear some questions and have a lively discussion with you all in our remaining time.
Yeah, just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat box, or you can raise your hand if you want to be unmuted and ask it live. We did have a question earlier, as people are thinking of their questions right now, that I'll share with you, Kelley. You mentioned it a little bit about time, but Alice was asking, do you have any recommendations for the amount of time to play a game? I know it depends on purpose, possibly depends on purpose. Is it for a review, introducing new vocab, grammar point? But her question was, if you have any recommendations for that.
Yeah, I think from my experience with the Activate games, I think about 10 minutes for a single game seems to be enough. Uh, Beyond 10 minutes, I think it gets a little bit tedious for the students because it's the same questions again and again if they've already gone through the game. However, if you have them make their own and you do like a rotation station, then you could do it for 30, 40 minutes. For example, if you were doing different vocabulary sets. So it does depend, but in general, I think, for an Activate game, 10 minutes seems to be enough from my experience. And it also depends on the proficiency level of the students and how much conversation they're able to have.
Yeah, thank you. Great. So we've got a lot of comments about thanking you and enjoying the different activities. Um, Throughout the webinar, people were also commenting on how games can contribute to building learner confidence. And I wonder if you have any ideas or thoughts on that about using board games.
Well, I think anything that you can do with students that increases their autonomy. So giving them a little bit of license and creative license, I think naturally is going to give them some confidence. And again, emphasizing fluency and even making that explicit in your class and telling them, I mean, I tell my students all the time, I want you to speak. It's not about speaking correctly. It's about speaking. It's about communicating. The accuracy comes with time. But really, I think in this culture, anything that you can do that actually encourages them and helps build their confidence so they don't feel so shy talking, I think is really important. And I think board games are a great tool for that, and encouraging them to create their own even, again, just really helps with that autonomy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. Yeah. So Alice followed up with a question. Are the games easy to explain when you first use them with students?
I have found that they're fairly easy to explain. Students tend to know, I think, intuitively how to play a board game. So rolling the die, and are harder than others in terms of the scaffolding needed. So if your students are new to the present perfect, for example, I think you might have to do several examples on the board, and that's okay. That's part of the lesson, is actually spending that time to scaffold their learning, and then they get several opportunities to practice both with regular and irregular verbs. So if it seems difficult at first, as teachers, our job, I think, is just not to get stressed out and really support them and scaffold their learning as much as possible.
It almost seems to like you're hinting to like a kind of routine of playing the games, like scaffolding it and building it into the classroom.
I think it's completely possible to do so, definitely. When you're teaching grammar points, I mean, we all know teach grammar lessons, and that can be done inductively and deductively. It doesn't always have to be explicit, but I do think there's a tendency, especially with lower level students and student expectations, they want to see the grammar rules, and they want to see that structurally. And so when you do that, building in a routine of playing the games actually takes that kind of, not as fun element of teaching grammar and makes it more about communication and language and use, which I think is really valuable. Yeah.
Great. So we have another question. Sharon asks, have you ever heard of Quiddler? Cards with letters and clusters. I would really like to know how to expand on this card game. She says the board game would be on the floor for students to expand their words out.
I have not seen Quiddler. Have you seen it? Has anybody seen it who can explain it? I have not seen Quiddler.
I haven't either. Sharon has commented that it's a US-based card game that can be used as a board game, but it can also be used on the table or floor.
Oh, cool.
She has some sets from Barnes & Noble in the US. Sounds quite interesting on the floor.
That's one of my favorite things about, these kinds of meetings is hearing from other teachers. Heather shared the other day, we did a workshop together, that heads up application on your phone. And I'm just like, wow, that's genius. You could use that so often. So For those of you who don't know it, there's a free app that you can download on your phone called Heads Up, where you can practice vocabulary. I highly recommend you check that out, and I'll definitely have a look at Quizlet. And Sharon, I'll definitely follow up with you over email about it if I have some ideas. I use memory games and bingo for vocabulary. Great. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was some other concentration games mentioned earlier, and activities like Hangman that people were talking, and there was some interest in the pronunciation activities that you shared earlier. Some appreciation for that.
Great, great. Yeah, I saw Alice mentioned using Hangman for teaching idioms, and I think Alice, you had told me that before when we were at the Mandalay workshop. I'd be interested to hear more about how to do that. Yeah.
And then Evelyn is mentioning Quizlet. I don't know if you have any experience using that, but she says it's good to practice with vocabulary online as well.
Yeah, Jeff was sharing Quizlet at the last workshop we did also. And one of the things that I appreciated about Quizlet is that students have to work together. So unlike Kahoot, where you're competing against each other, Quizlet really, I don't want to use the word force, but it kind of forces learners to interact and negotiate meaning. So I really enjoy Quizlet as well. Yeah.
So it sounds like there's some low tech and high tech options here for using games in classes. And so Alice says that I used Hangman at the beginning of class when waiting for late students. Extra points were given on tests.
Nice. Yeah. No more than 2 or 3 idioms at a time. Great. Yeah, I think that's one of the things with the high tech and low tech. One of the challenges I have with technology is it seems like every time you make a big plan and you design a Quizlet or you design a Kahoot, and then you get to class and the internet connection is slow and the students can't do it, and it can be frustrating. So I feel like sometimes it's nice to have a backup plan. So you have the analog version, you have your board game ready to go if the Quizlet doesn't work. Yeah.
And then another thing that came up earlier is some people were commenting on the checklist.
Yeah.
And so maybe you can comment a little bit more about how you might use that in your classes in different ways than the example that you showed.
Yeah, I mean, beyond what I already mentioned, which is just walking around and listening, rather than pointing out, because the point of games is to encourage their fluency. So interrupting them to correct them can kind of do the opposite and maybe, discourage them. So I think going around, it doesn't have to be a formal checklist, but just going around and even making notes of what you're hearing so that you can then go to the board and write down a few words and have them practice those words because you heard them mispronounced so many times, and not point out a single learner, but as a group, let's practice these words. I think that can be really helpful, and still be encouraging to students. If you have I know many of the AUA teachers, you have smaller classes, and then you can actually use a checklist with your individual learners and make notes, and maybe even do kind of a weekly report for them. And hey, this is what I noticed about your speaking. You might want to work on these pronunciations, these sounds. That way, you're giving them specific individual feedback also. I know that's not really possible if you have a large class, but in smaller classes, I think you can do that.
Yeah, some people are now commenting, and Evelyn says, yeah, the key word is feedback, giving that to the students. And Sharon suggests using a whiteboard without interrupting. And yeah, what I heard from you too is you can have the opportunity to highlight areas of growth and possibly two areas of strength that you hear, right? As you said, the data for the students to be aware of their language that they're using. So I think that's a great checklist that you shared with everyone there, an example.
Absolutely. And the other thing I would point out, one thing that I notice with my students, and I'm not sure why this is with pronunciation, but often they can hear the difference. So when I play like that bingo game with the sh and ch sound, they can hear the difference much better than they can produce it. So, in that way, I have to give credit to an English language fellow who was here last year, Jenna. She really talked a lot about having students use their phones as a mirror and actually demonstrating, the mouth formation for these sounds. And I found that it really worked with my students, that their pronunciation improved a lot by doing the very awkward pronunciation exercises.
That sounds like a great activity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To be a fly on the wall.
Mm.
Okay.
If anyone has any more questions, please let us know in the Q&A. Thanks so much for all the comments that you've shared and for joining us today. We'll leave the webinar open for just a few more minutes to answer any questions that you have, but we want to thank you on behalf of the RELO Regional English Language Office in Bangkok and AUA Language Center for joining us today. And thank you, Kelley, for a fantastic webinar on how to say bye-bye to boredom with using board games. And I know that the attendees are expressing a lot of gratitude and excitement for the new activities and games that they'll get to use in the future. So that is really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed this evening with all of you.
Okay, with that, looks like there aren't any more. One more question from Sharon. Will you be sending us the websites and activities? Yes, you will receive this webinar recording within 48 hours and also an email with the different links to the activities. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us after you receive that email and just let us know. Okay, thanks so much, guys, and we'll be in touch soon.